What are your takeaways from the House tax bill?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? I mean, personally, I wouldn't do it the way that they're doing it. It seems more fair if it's just a cut across the board, And so, hey, we're gonna the current tax brackets that we have now sunset. If they don't sunset, it's a massive tax increase,
Hmm.
right? However, keeping those costs $4.5 trillion for the
Hmm.
next 10 years. Okay. You can't get 4.5 trillion out of the normal things that you might cut. And so now Medicaid, close to $1 trillion worth of Medicaid cuts are on the table. And, I would prefer that it was across the board, Social Security departments, all 5-10% cuts everywhere. Because, the average American gets the fact that we're running a deficit, and nobody does that in their own household without running into problems. You can't borrow, $1,000 a month on your credit card forever, before you start to have problems and end up in bankruptcy. And that's the concern here. And so I think if you went out and you were, more even across the board, say, hey, we're gonna reinstate these tax brackets, but they're gonna be a little bit higher. And maybe there'll be a tax for the million and above,
Hmm.
and so that we can kind of even that out instead of pushing the pain so heavily into really the lower 20% of the earners are going to take it in the chops here between the lack of tax cuts that they get and the increased they're more susceptible to the increases of costs, and they're more susceptible to, using things like Medicaid as far as that goes. However, from a pure stock market standpoint, the tax bill is stimulative if the deficit isn't so high that the bond market can't help it,
Hmm.
right? Can't handle it. And so that's a big takeaway. That's important, at least from the stock market standpoint, no matter what you think about how this works. And I would say one of the things I run across all the time with my clients, you can't really invest based on what you feel about things. You have to invest in the way that the market feels about those things.
Hmm.
The market, so far, bond market is up 2 days in a row since that House bill passed, right? The Treasury bond market is up. That's a big sign to me. We'll see if it continues, but it's a big sign to me. And, a deficit is technically stimulative to the economy because that's $2.3 trillion that will be going into the economy in total, right? Now, unfortunately, when you do these tax cuts and it's lopped higher towards the higher earners, uh, they pay more in tax. But the key problem from an economic standpoint is that they tend to not spend it. You
Yeah,
know,
the growth is less trickle down than expected usually.
oh yeah, the trickle down concept has been hasn't worked. And so, versus, hey, you give more money to that bottom 20%, you really want to stimulate the economy, you would do that. And that's essentially what happened with that $1.9 trillion bill that was done, that COVID relief bill
Hmm.
was funneled down towards that lower end of the spectrum, in terms of income wise. And we ended up with inflation because of that, because they were out spending that money versus, you give it to a bunch of people that have a lot of money, they tend to put it in the stock market, which would help stock market some, or, save it and what have you. So, uh, but overall, the stock market's going to look at that tax cut bill as positive as long as that deficit is something that is amenable, right?
Yeah.
And I think at 3.8 trillion, didn't like it. Bond market didn't like it. Stock market didn't like it. At 2.3 trillion, so far,
It's okay.
yeah, I think the stock market's coming down right now because of what's happening with the EU tariffs and Apple and that kind of stuff. But I think it's okay. So that'd be my biggest takeaway from it. It does have some potential to help the stock market here as far as that goes, and we'll see, how much that deficit actually turns out to be. That's my fear because in the past, 2.3 trillion projected deficit turns out to be much higher than that.
Yeah, and the thing is, we're still not at the final iteration of this bill. It
No.
has to go
Yeah.
through the Senate. What gets cut or added by the Senate
Yep.
is going to go, and then it has to come back to the House to get revoted. And so it's one step forward, but we don't know what the end result will be.
Yeah, well, we do know that they're trying really hard to keep the campaign promises, the tax on tips, tax on overtime, Social Security taxation, not keeping that promise exactly, but there'll be a $4,000 additional add-on to your standard deduction if
Yeah,
you're over 65, right? And they're trying to keep the 2017 tax brackets in place. Unfortunately, if you do all of that, you're gonna cut someplace else pretty heavy, and some of
yeah.
those areas are
And I
things that
think
people
Medicaid
like.
and
Yep,
SNAP programs are
right.
probably going to be what's on the chopping block.
Yeah, that's right, exactly right. And so that's a brutal trade-off, at least from a social or societal standpoint, or even from a polling standpoint.
Hmm.
I think it's really high. I think it's like 70 to 80% of Americans don't want to see cuts to Medicaid. So that's why they're burying them to start after the midterms at this point in time. So I don't know how they're going to close that deficit from the 2.3 trillion lower, even in these itinerations, because they're not willing to give up on the cuts. Those were promises made, fair enough. And so the only way they can bring it lower is actually make more cuts and bring Medicaid higher, whatever else they want to throw into the mixture there.
Is it
So
defense spending? What other,
yeah, well, they're adding 150 billion to the defense funding. So that always gets added to it. It's an interesting area. I don't know enough about how defense funding works and where it goes. I know just to keep prepared for action, it's really expensive. I mean,
mhm.
all the maintenance and all the training and all those things. So, and that's important to our overall security and such too. But yeah, it's an interesting bill. We'll see how it plays out, but I think the market would like it.